Hi, and welcome to Chapter 32, Learning Objective 4. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. What we're going to talk about here is how do trade policies impact these various panels of graphs that we've been looking at. So in looking at this trade policy, I gave you an entire PDF on the trade policy in 2020 at the end of this show. It's 336 pages. None of it will be on the test, but if you're interested, it's there. So it's a governmental policy, and what it looks at, and it's specifically focused at the third panel or third graph that we've been looking at in this chapter, okay? So specifically, that graph has the real currency exchange. It has net capital outflow. I'm just going to leave that there. And more so, it has net exports. So it focuses specifically on the net exports, which has an effect on the real exchange rate. So the three that we look at traditionally are a tariff, which is where we have a tax on imports. Normally, that's to keep it within a fair range of prices, because if we cannot domestically provide that product or that service at the cost that it takes because of whatever, there's no EPA, FDA, OSHA, all that in another country. So there's a minimum. And what the tariff does is brings the import into this fair range of trade, okay? An import quota is what we're going to look at here. And this is a limit on the amount of imports that you can bring in. So how does that one work? And an import quota, remember going back to net exports, exports minus imports. In an effort to close the trade gap, okay, what we might do is limit the amount of imports. So let's say right now we have a trade gap of 5 exports and 8 imports. So net exports here in this example would be -3, showing a trade deficit. We would then impose a limit on the imports. So what would happen is that 8 would fall, maybe with 5 to 6. Now net exports become less negative at a -1. So essentially what happens here, as you can see, is net exports will increase because we're limiting the amount of imports that are coming in. Okay, so what's the impact of an import quota? First of all, we're going to decrease imports. We're going to increase net exports. Now, what also happens is there's an increase in the demand for dollars in the foreign currency exchange, because essentially we're dealing with that third panel. So remember, net capital outflow flows from the second graph we looked at. Here are net exports, okay? Where the two crisscross, here's where the real exchange rate is. What we're doing is we are increasing net exports, so it's going to shift outward to the right, which does what? Increases the real exchange rate. Okay, so this is all taking place only in panel 3. Notice net capital outflow stayed the same. Okay, so no real change in graph 1. So graph 1 remains the same. No change in net capital outflow. That was graph 2. That stays the same. Is there no change in net exports? Well, there kind of is, right? Because we saw that graph 3 does in fact change, okay? And we're going to see a decrease in the amount of imports, but what might offset that, and that's why I say might, okay? So I'm using a might here. If we see a decrease in exports because of the demand for dollars in the foreign exchange market, more so the real exchange rate increasing, which may cause a wash. So that's why we're saying here no change in net exports. So this kind of shows you that everything takes place over here in that real exchange rate panel. Here we call it panel C. I'm trying to find my pointer. There you are. Okay, so everything takes place over here in this graph. Everything else before it, panel 2, panel 1, graph 2, all remain the same. Okay, so do trade policies affect U.S. trade balance? Not exactly, because again, they don't affect panel 1 and panel 2. What they really affect, again, is that third panel, and they tend to be specific to particular industries. And this is why you might see particular firms, industries, and perhaps countries looking at trade policy. But it doesn't really affect the gap there because it will wash itself out. Makes sense?